The Western world has created a habit of always looking for the newest health fads and diets, but with no regards to the impact of the countries who struggle environmentally in order to appease their customers. Focusing on the environmental impact of the Western demand of asparagus and quinoa in Bolivia and Peru, the demand has created a strain on farmers to produce as much asparagus and quinoa that they can. Both quinoa and asparagus come from Peru with a central contribution from Bolivia, and these countries are neighboring countries on the southwest coastline in South America, and they're considered third world countries who have been struggling to respond to the global market demand of their crops. Environmental concern has arisen because of the conditions needed to grow the two crops, mainly because of the water and land. Asparagus is a vegetable that requires 24 to 30 inches of water, which in America can cost a farmer up to 2,000 to 2,500 per acre. And it's for this reason that America has actually decreased their growth of asparagus. And in order to work with that, in the 90s, both NAFTA and the Indian Trade Preference Act removed protective tariffs of asparagus imported from Latin American countries, and immediately cheap asparagus started to flood into the markets, which no longer necessitated the work of the American or Western farmers. This was fine with the Latin American countries, especially Peru, until the same issues that plagued America started to plague them. In Ica Valley, Peru, where asparagus is mainly grown, they've seen a drastic plummet of their water and wells since 2002, and it's actually the fastest depletion of water, with 8 meters being lost per year. And more than 18,500 people have been impacted within the community. Farmers are resorting to sustain their families with only 10 liters of water per person per day, when a person actually needs 5 times that amount to be healthy. The same impact is seen with quinoa, but not as much environmentally as it is socially. Quinoa doesn't require as much water and the labor, but the demand is actually higher because it's only grown in Bolivia and Peru. Farmers are actually fighting neighbors because they're fighting over claims of land rights, and this has the potential of turning into huge land disputes. People who flock to the cities to find jobs are moving back into the country, and they're trying to reclaim their former land in order for them to start growing quinoa, but this is also creating issues because they no longer own that land. As more and more quinoa is being exported, people in their countries are actually unable to afford and enjoy quinoa. In Peru, quinoa prices have tripled and is now actually 4 times more expensive than rice and chicken. Um, and this is creating tensions and hostility of poor families towards the upper and middle class, and that has the potential of creating structural violence, which is actually being seen now. As well as being a cultural staple, quinoa is actually important to the people's health. Because of its unique characteristics, quinoa has been promoted across the country as a grain that can help curb chronic malnutrition rates, which is actually a really big problem in Bolivia and Peru. But it's actually had a positive effect in dropping the chronic malnutrition rates actually by 16.1%. But it may actually go back up because farmers aren't able to grow as much and families can't afford them in order to feed their family. And all of these negative effects, they're overseen by the positive of effects. In 2012, Peru made $35 million in quinoa exports, which was triple the amount in 2009. Same thing in Bolivia, their exports tripled, 85 million just from quinoa alone. Many jobs have been created as well. Over 10,000 new jobs were created by the World Bank. But ironically, as people grow more and more quinoa, they're actually producing less and less. And there are two main reasons. One being the land. When you start to overwork your land, you're not going to get as much because of the mineral depletion. But on top of that, you have bugs. And actually in Peru and Bolivia, bugs were unheard of, but now with more crops being used, more land being used, bugs are attracted to it. And this has increased the use of pesticides, which farmers didn't use before because they had no need. But now that they're using it, it's impacting their growth of the food, which is not good because they're trying to grow more. And so they're unable to now because of that. Also, water shortages are occurring more frequently. Farmers are unable to develop as much asparagus because of that, much less sustain their own families. So you have organizations like the World Bank, as mentioned before, and also the UN, who actually hosted the UN International Year of Quinoa in 2013, which celebrated quinoa. And they focused on these positives, but they haven't acknowledged the negative effects, which brings up the case of the responsibility to protect, which both have not made the effort. Both the UN and the World Bank have not made the effort. The UN Development Program quotes that human development is the end and economic growth is the mean. which makes what Peru and Bolivia are doing in the UN and the World Bank's eyes perfectly legitimate. They're focusing on the economic growth, which is what those organizations want, and they're hoping that later on they'll focus on the rights of their people. But these rights, which are outlined by the UN Declaration of Rights, are actually being violated. The focus of economic growth has led to a loss of cultural identity, which is seen with the decrease of quinoa being eaten by the people who actually grow it. You also see income inequality, which is definitely seen with the inability of Peruvians and Bolivians not being able to afford their own food. And you've also got the overconsumption of natural resources, which is seen with the loss of land and water. Now, all three of those are violations of Articles 22, 25, and 27. But the UN themselves, who outlined these rights, haven't done anything about it. So, along with the World Bank and the UN responsibility to protect, the governments of Bolivia and Peru actually have more of a right, or I guess you can say more of a position, to promote the responsibility to protect their people, but they also are choosing to ignore that because of the amount of money that they're getting in, which is building the power of Peru and Bolivia. It's increasing their world and trade standing. Bolivia themselves are actually encouraging more and more quinoa growth. They're giving farmers up to 10 million of loans in order to grow more things. So, when you look at what the UN World Commission on Environment and Development says, a country must meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of generations to meet their own needs. And what the study has proven is that this is being played out right now. Bolivian and Peruvian farmers are worried about their children's future without crops and water, and their country's future, because without these crops, they won't be able to sustain Peru and Bolivia's standing economically. And as a global community in coexistence, we have to fight and find a way to compensate for the loss that our Western interests have generated, or else the future of the Bolivian and Peruvian farmers, and the growth of quinoa asparagus will be grim.